So I recently just shot a feature film on the Lumix S5, and I thought to just take the chance to talk a little bit about it, why we chose the Lumix S5, talk a little bit about the production and how I was using it. Maybe it's an opportunity for you guys to see if maybe it's a camera that you guys can use for your own feature film. So a little bit about the production. It was a very low budget feature film production. It was shot in around 15 days. We were around 5 people behind camera and just a few actors in front of it, around 2 to 4, 4 at most, and sometimes 2 and sometimes 3. And it was mostly shot outside in the woods with only natural light. We didn't really have many modifiers to shape the light. It was quite a hectic production in that we had to shoot around 6 pages every day. Sometimes we even shot up to 10 pages in a day. And that meant that we had to be nimble because we need to go up and down to the woods every day. And we also had to be quick because we need to shoot a lot of shots in one day, or a lot of setups. I think we shot around 30 to 50 setups each day. So it meant that we had to be quite quick. So that's why I decided to use the Lumix S5. It was a very minimalist setup. It was just the camera body, a PL mount, and then the Blazer Remus 35mm, which is a budget anamorphic. And we only used one lens to keep it simple. And we didn't rig out the camera at all. We just used it as is. And the only extra thing we had was a transmitter on top of the camera so that we could get the sound that the sound recordist was recording into the camera so that we could sync the sound afterwards. And actually, everything I used in the production, I had space in this small bag. So it's quite simple. Every day, I just put the camera and the lens inside the bag. And it took me half a minute to set up the camera. It was ready to go. And to be honest, I think it worked quite great. It meant that we didn't have to use a lot of time setting up each shot. We didn't use a tripod. I only used it handheld, holding it with my hands. It was quite a relaxing way to shoot for me. I also was the only camera person on set. So I was operating the camera and also pulling focus. So we didn't have an external monitor. I only used the monitor on the camera to shoot everything. For me, it was nice to just fully commit to the low budget filmmaking and the minimalist filmmaking because we didn't really have much resources or any at all. So the small rig meant that it was faster to put together. It was faster to change setups. It was also less draining. It didn't, take a lot of energy dragging the camera around. I can just hold it in my hand or put it in a bag and easily transport it to different locations. And it didn't really take any space in my car or anything. So quite a simple way to shoot. And talk a little bit about the battery life. We used just the battery that comes with the Lumix S5, and then we also used some like second-hand or not official batteries, but batteries that was made from other companies. That was not made by Panasonic. It worked great. We shot for around 8 to 10 hours each day, and I didn't really have to use more than 3 batteries each day. For most days, we actually only used 2 batteries. The batteries are quite cheap and small, so I actually was able to bring like 8 batteries, but as I mentioned, I only needed to use 3. And they're also quite cheap. So I think one battery costs around $20. So it wasn't like a huge expense having the batteries. And what's great about the Lumix S5 is that it doesn't take a lot of time booting up. So between takes, I could easily just turn off the camera and then wait until they said they were ready again. And then I can just turn on the camera. Took like a second to boot up. And then it was ready to go. So maybe perhaps one of the reasons why I didn't have to use that many batteries is that it's because the camera wasn't on at all times. If you compare it to a RED camera, for example, which uses what I've seen up to like a minute to boot up, you have to keep that camera on at all times so you don't waste time booting it up. Then it also uses much bigger batteries that takes a lot more power to use. So that was a great thing. We saved a lot of battery by doing that. It was just very practical in many ways. And also, we shot this in July. It was up to 30 degrees Celsius inside the woods. We didn't get that much direct sun at us, so it wasn't like direct heat at the camera, but there was no point where the camera overheated at all. I never got a warning. It was never anything I worried about. I didn't think about it at all, if the camera was overheating at all. So it was never really an issue, using the camera and thinking about it overheating or not. So that was also a great thing. Let's talk a little bit about image quality, because we were shooting in the woods, only using natural light, so we couldn't control the light that much, or at all. This meant that having a great dynamic range was important. And there was no point during the production where I felt I needed, more dynamic range. We never really clipped the highlights. And even when we did, sometimes, like when the sky or the sun is peeping through the trees, maybe sometimes it was clipping a little bit, but it didn't really look bad. The highlight roll-off looked quite pleasant. And I really had any issues with the lack of light or, overexposure or anything like that. And I think the image that came out of the camera looked really good. I never really missed using a better camera or having RAW or anything like that, especially considering we used the Blazer Remus 35mm. It just looked quite organic and didn't really have that clinical digital look that you might think you would get out of a camera like Lumix S5. So I was quite happy with it. It looked really cinematic, in my opinion. Sadly, I won't be able to show you guys what we shot. I'll do it for another video, but I'll show you examples from other test shoots that we did with the camera with the same setup. And also, the camera has dual native ISO, both 640 and 4000 ISO. So this means that we had the flexibility. Let's say we had a little bit less light, or we wanted to really nail exposure with using ND filters and stuff like that. We were able to crank the ISO to get more light, especially for lower light scenes. Also, there were some scenes it was hard to nail focus, so I stopped the lens down to T11. And that was also handy to have the 4000 ISO. So the whole film was shot handheld. We didn't use a tripod. We didn't use a easy rig or anything like that. I just held it in my hands with my two hands. And I actually never really used a 3-point contact either, which I probably should have done. But it looked good, especially with the IBIS that comes with the Lumix S5. It's like kind of crazy how steady shots you can get without it looking too crazy. Or having this like floaty effect. I think it looked quite natural and didn't really stick out to me for like 99% of the shots. And especially considering that we were shooting in Anamorphic. And if you look at the sides of Anamorphic, there's some funky stuff going on. So the stabilization becomes much more noticeable compared to, spherical lenses. The great thing about the Lumix S5 is that it has a Anamorphic IBIS. I really didn't have any issues at all. I thought it looked great. And also, one of the problems with the Lumix S5 is that it has a very slow readout speed, around 22 milliseconds or something like that. So when you're shooting handheld, you can sometimes get that jello effect, especially us, because we were panning quite hard and walking around with the camera a lot and whip panning and stuff like that. But the lens that we used was the Blazer Remus 35mm, which is a Super 35 lens. So what I did was that I used the APS-C crop instead. So what's happened then is that the readout speed gets cut in half. So then you only have a 10 millisecond readout speed, which is a significant improvement. So at that point, even when shooting anamorphic, we didn't really have any issues with the jello effect or anything like that. We were able to whip pan and everything like that without it looking funky. So I was really pleased with that, actually. And it made the film look a lot more professional. I feel like the APS-C mode image that you get out of the Lumix S5 looks a lot more sturdy because it doesn't have that jello effect. She wanted to be on camera. Sorry. Oi. And as mentioned earlier, we didn't have a external monitor. We only used the monitor that came with the camera. And the great thing about the Lumix S5 is that it has internal anamorphic desqueeze. So you were able to squeeze the image on that monitor without having to use a external monitor. And if you compare that to something like the Sony FX3, which also has anamorphic desqueeze, but only 1.33x and 2x, but this camera has a 1.5 squeeze internally, and the Blazer Remus 35mm has a 1.5 squeeze as well. It's actually quite impressive for such a camera which I think, you know, you can get the Lumix S5 for around $700, $600. So we were able to monitor the Desqueeze without having to use a external monitor, which was quite handy when we want to really have a really small and nimble and minimalist setup. Since we only used the camera and didn't have a external monitor, we also weren't able to shoot in B-RAW or anything like that. We only used the internal codecs that came with the camera. So I ended up using the 422 10-bit 4K, and that's around 150 megabytes per second, which is quite small. And some people might be scared that we'll get a lot of artifacts and it will look quite compressed. But I didn't really have any issues with it. And actually, the 422 10-bit H.264 that comes with the camera is actually the reason why I want to use the camera for the production, because we didn't really have a lot of money. So we actually saved a lot of money by using a camera with a small codec. So we didn't have to use a lot of money on hard drives. If you compare that to my previous film, Above the Knee, which used the Ursa Mini Pro 12K in B-RAW 8K, we end up using around 20 terabytes of storage in one hard drive, and we also had to back up that hard drive, so it actually became quite expensive. But if you compare that to this production, we only used around 2 terabytes of storage. So we could use much smaller and cheaper hard drives compared to my previous productions. And of course, on a bigger production, that isn't that big of a expense. But on a production like this, it actually meant a lot that we didn't have to use a lot of money on hard drives. We also used quite a cheap hard drive, the Leica Lysia or something like that. I don't know what it's called, but it was only a couple of $100. And I'm actually editing the film now on a MacBook Mini or MacBook Pro or something like that, which I bought used for around $500 a couple of months ago, which is quite an old laptop. I think it's from 2020. And I've had no issues editing or color grading the compressed footage. It doesn't stutter. I didn't have to make proxies to use the files or edit the files. And also, I think color grading the footage also looked really great. I wasn't really missing B-RAW or anything like that. I thought, you know, the compressed codec was more than enough to get the image that I wanted. So a couple of negative things. The camera does not have a OLPF filter or a OLP filter. So there was a couple of shots where you could see noticeable moire in the background in some of the walls. And it wasn't like a super big deal. It's not that noticeable, but, you know, it's obviously not a good thing that it was moire. So I wish it had a OLPF filter. We also had to be quite wary on what costumes we could use. There were certain clothes that the actors couldn't use, or costumes, because we didn't have that filter, because we were scared of the moire. So that was a little bit of an issue, but for 99.5% of the shots, it was no issue. We didn't really notice it. And also, the anamorphic kind of helps making it less sharp, I think. So it didn't look like clinical or super sharp, even though we didn't have the OLP filter. As I mentioned earlier, I was holding the camera with 2 hands. I didn't have a shoulder rig or easy rig. So sometimes it was quite hard or quite heavy just holding the camera with my 2 hands because I didn't have any stability. But for some shots, actually, back to like the IBIS, which was quite impressive, is that if I had some stabilization and 3-point stabilization or 3-point contact, I was actually able to get shots that looked like it was on a tripod. But sometimes when I held with just my 2 hands, we sometimes had some really long takes. It became quite heavy on my biceps because I was using my biceps quite a lot and my shoulders. So that was something that wasn't that good of a thing. But it was more like a minor problem. If you compare that to much bigger cameras that you have on your shoulder, that's much heavier. But it's something to think about. But otherwise, the camera was very reliable. It never shut down It never overheated, nothing like that. I was just in general quite happy with the results that we got from the camera when it comes to just using it, but also the image that we got from the camera. So I think if you're wondering if the Lumix S5 is good enough for a low-budget production, I would say so, especially if you're very much leaning into doing a very low-budget production. I think it could be wise to invest and use a smaller camera like the Lumix S5 instead of using a lot of energy on like a bigger camera, like a Red or an Ari or something like that, especially if you don't really have the money and don't have the resources to, you know, operate the camera. And if you're a one-man band especially, I think the Lumix S5 can be a very great option for those that make small budget feature films. Hope this was useful. Maybe some of you might have your eyes more opened to a camera like the Lumix S5. Please do tell me if you use the camera yourself in on a short film or a feature film or anything like that. And yeah, hope you enjoyed.